Good morning, everyone. So I see we have currently almost 30% that are attending. We are expecting about 40, 50 people today. So I propose that we start and people will join, I guess, shortly. So thank you for joining this morning breakfast briefing for corporate governance officers. Today we're going to speak about the topic that's very interesting for corporate governance officer because they are facing this quite often. It's the appointment or change of domiciliary agent or corporate service provider. And we're really happy and glad to have with us today two specialists. So we have Mathieu VACHER from Arendt Investor Services SA. He's the director there. And we have also Francis KASS, who is working at Medernach SA and is a partner there. They will lead the session of today. I thank you for joining. And once again, we try to organize 4 breakfasts during the year and forums as well. It's really great to see that we have more and more people joining. And I'll let the floor to Mathieu to introduce the topic. And thanks again for being with us today.
Good morning, everyone. So, as explained by Richard, I'm Mathieu VACHER, and thank you for joining for this breakfast briefing for corporate governance officers on appointing or changing a domiciliary agent or corporate services provider. Let's go with the slides. So, on my side, so I'm the director of the governance services department. So this is a department dedicated to corporate secretarial activity. And I'm in charge of the large outsourcing of the corporate secretarial activity for large clients. So we have a dedicated team of several corporate secretary for a single client, let's say having a group of companies. It's been 20 years that I'm doing now corporate secretary in Luxembourg. So I have some ideas on how I want to present this topic with you today. And I'm here with Francis from Arendt and Medernach.
Yes, thank you, Mathieu, and good morning to everyone. Yeah, so I'm Francis KASS, a partner at Arendt and Medernach, so the law firm within the Arendt group. Yeah, I've always been working in the investment funds area, so helping clients to set up liquid funds, now recently maybe a bit more illiquid, so real estate, private equity, private debt funds, but also their management companies. But then all the corporate governance aspects are also very important to me, be it to put in place the information flows, how advising directors on how they can perform their duties best, the liquidation aspects, but then as we see today, it can also be more general corporate governance, corporate secretarial aspects. And so happy to, together with Mathieu, to take you through all of those aspects. Maybe, and I think Richard has already announced it. So our program for the next hour is that indeed, so we will talk about maybe first, setting the scene. So there are different concepts regarding what is a domiciliary agent, what is a corporate agent. And so I will always add a little bit the investment fund note. So I will put that into context as to also what is a fund administrator. So that is what we will start with. What are those different concepts? What does each of the service providers do? How can they be appointed? What would we recommend in terms of selection process, but then also the ongoing monitoring? Then what is the legal requirement in terms of content of the agreement with the service providers? But then later on, we will also speak about how to change the service provider, or how can the service provider terminate the agreement. So that's a little bit the program for today. And then maybe I will let Mathieu start with the domiciliary agent and corporate agent.
Yes, so let's start by some definitions, because we have to put the context in place first, and to define what is a domiciliary agent and corporate agent. So for domiciliary agent, there is a law, the law of 31st of May 1999, that what we call usually the domiciliation law, and that is defining what is a domiciliary agent. So it's a natural or legal person who, with respect to a company in which it is not a partner, exerting significant influence over the conduct of business, allows that company to establish the head office at the domiciliary agent's premises and conduct business from there, and provide services for the domicile company. So the standard service would be to forward the correspondence received at the registered address, for example. So that's domiciliation. So this is the provision of the registered address and the maintenance of the corporate files. And the corporate service provider is a bit more wide. Let's say it's an entity or individual providing corporate services by way of business. It's of course with remuneration, including formation of companies, directorship, company secretary services, provision of registered office, correspondence address for investors, managers of funds, corporate and private wealth. So any type of third parties, let's say, are in scope for a corporate service provider. This is a non-exhaustive list. Of course, the corporate services are quite extended, and it's hard to give an exhaustive definition, because it depends on the needs of the clients and the entity. So domiciliation is an appropriate solution. Yes. Sorry. So domiciliation is just to mention an appropriate solution for companies which, by nature of their activities, do not need their own premises. Usually they have no employees. It's just the board members that are part of it. But that's for sure. If you have employees, you start renting an office, and it's not a domiciliation anymore. With a domiciliary agent, it becomes your office and a rent. So that's the difference, of course. Now, who is authorized to provide domiciliation or registered address, or to act as corporate secretary or corporate services provider? Again, we have the domiciliation law that gives some, let's say, some rules on that topic. So you need to be registered as a domiciliary agent. So there is a registration to be done, and some criteria to be met in terms of minimum capital and in terms of expertise to become a registered member able to act as domiciliary agent. And this is with the CSSF and this agreement. And who can be a registered member? So the credit institution, another professional of the financial sector. So Arendt Investor Services is a PSF, and that's why we are able to do domiciliary function. The insurance sector, the attorney at law, like Arendt and Medernach, is able to through lawyers, but it's not the key activity usually of lawyers. But lawyers are able also to provide domiciliation. European lawyers, réviseurs d'entreprise, so agréé, or the chartered accountant also are able to provide domiciliation. For corporate services providers, we have banks, specialized PSF, investment firms, insurance sectors professional, statutory auditors, chartered professional accountants, lawyers, and so on. So again, if you have any question, feel free to put this in the chat, and we will take your question, normally all of them, at the end of the session. That's it for the who is able to act as services provider or domiciliary agent. And in terms of services for domiciliation, definitely, as I mentioned, this is the provision of the registered address, but linked to that, the domiciliary agent needs to keep safely the company's file. And I put a list on the slide that you can see. This is the basic list, but all documents of the company should be stored at the level of the domiciliary agent at the registered address. You have the articles of association of the company, the minutes of the meeting, corporate tax return, register of shareholders, financial statements, accounting documentation like bank statements and so on. The except from the trade register, the RB, the publication for the RESA, all the contracts, any other documents, any other correspondence, notices, communication that deems necessary. So usually it's quite a complete file that we are expecting from the domiciliary agent with all the history since the first day of the creation of the company. And of course, the domiciliary agent has also the obligation to transmit all this correspondence to the board members for them to be able to acknowledge the correspondence and to take any action if necessary. For corporate services, the same. I put a small list, but again, this is not really defined by law what is corporate services. So you can see first the organization of the general meetings of the board of the company, the accounting services, the accounting obligations, all the filings and publication and so on. So you can continue the list depending on the need of the client. And now, what are the legal obligations of the domiciliary agent corporate services provider? First, of course, you need to identify the company's board member, its shareholders, and its ultimate beneficial owners. The domiciliary agent or even the corporate services provider, because usually they are PSF, they are subject to the AML law of 2004. So they need to do their due diligence before accepting the domiciliation of a company. Then this documentation that is used to identify board members, shareholders, UBOs must be kept at the level of the domiciliary agent. So usually you store it in the safe area, out of the standard corporate file, and you will have to keep this identification document 5 years after the termination of the domiciliation as domiciliary agent. And I just wanted to mention also that domiciliary agent or PSF, of course, needs to comply with all the requests received from the authorities responsible for the application of law, fully cooperate with the Luxembourg authorities responsible for combating AML and so on. So, of course, you have GDPR, you have professional secrecy on all the documentation that you receive, but the limit is the need of public authorities or request from either all the authorities like CSSF, also if it's a regulated entity. And yes, based on the first point, I wanted also to highlight the circular 0147 of the CSSF. They recommend to create a business committee in charge of the acceptance of the new file. That's what we call also sometimes the CAC, the Client Acceptance Committee. Depends. It may have different names depending on the service provider, but definitely you need first to do this due diligence and to accept the client. And there is an ongoing update of this due diligence file depending on the risk classification of the entity. It depends on the service provider. It may be every 3 years, every year if it's high risk activity. But you need to put in place the appropriate control measures and follow constantly the activity exercised by the company. So this is a permanent supervision, and that's important to mention. Even if you are only a domiciliary agent, you still need to get access to the accounting document to have a look and to alert the authorities if you see anything that looks suspicious. So you have this obligation of monitoring of the activity of the companies you are domiciling, and that's why before to accept a company and to provide your registered address, it's good to know what's the activity of the company, what's the flow of funds, who is behind the company or the investment, because it's an obligation that you have to monitor this from a compliance perspective. AML perspective.
Okay, thank you, Mathieu. And yeah, so as mentioned, I will always put this in the context of how do those concepts translate in the world of investment funds? Yeah, because if we look at the specific rules and regulations applying to funds, there is no specific rule regarding domiciliation. So we don't have, I think Mathieu has mentioned the law of 1999 for domiciliation of any kind of companies. There is no specific law for domiciliation of funds. So in principle, this law of 1999 also applies to funds. It applies to any type of entities. However, what we have then more specifically in the world of investment funds is that, yeah, as many of you know, we have the concept of fund administration. And this fund administration is governed by this CSF Circular 22-811. And yeah, if we look into this, we will not go into every detail, but generally this circular says that, yeah, so fund administration is composed of three main pillars. So it's the registrar function, so meaning maintenance of the fund shareholders register, receiving and executing subscription and redemption orders, distributing income. So that's the first pillar, registrar. The second is NAV calculation and accounting. And the third one, client communication, yeah, meaning production and the delivery of documents for investors. Now, if we look into this, and if we compare what Mathieu said just a few minutes ago, so he was also mentioning keeping documents, reporting, accounting, general meetings of shareholders, board meetings. And so all of this is very similar to what we have here, or at least it's part of it. So this CSF Circular 22-811 does not specifically mention domiciliation. But yeah, if we look into a bit more detail, what is fund administration? So it also includes tasks such as bookkeeping, drawing up of financial reports, preparing general meetings, reportings, maintaining documents, receiving and treating customer inquiries or complaints. So all of that is very similar. And that leads me to say, well, I would consider that fund administration is certainly much broader than just either domiciliation or corporate service agent, but it is very similar, and it typically also includes those various elements of domiciliation and corporate services. And that is maybe where we can then go to the next slide. Indeed, when we talk about the different type of setups that we see for investment funds, I said early on, that fund administration typically includes domiciliation and corporate servicing. That is what I mentioned here. Funds are typically domiciled with their administrator. Here also, Mathieu was mentioning early on who can act as domiciliary agent, who can act as corporate agent. We, of course, also have rules and who can be a fund administrator. And that's typically banks, or there's then specific statuses of registrar agents, administrative agents, but also management companies. Management companies can, for example, domicile the funds that they manage, or IFMs. So those would be the typical agents that we see, or for example, Arendt Investor Services, which is not a bank, but which is a professional of the financial sector, then also qualifying as a registrar agent. But when I say that funds are typically domiciled with their administrator, there are also other options. Either that the fund itself says, well, okay, we appoint one entity as administrator, but we appoint another one as our domiciliary agent. And that could be the case, for example, among the list of service providers who can provide this service. I mentioned management companies, for example. So one could say, yeah, the fund has its administrator on the one hand, it has the management company on the other hand, and we also ask the management company to domicile the fund. So that is one option. Or we can say, even if the fund appoints an administrator, but then the administrator itself delegates certain functions to somebody else, or one could maybe even say sub-delegates, and it could also sub-delegate the domiciliation to somebody else. All of those activities are regulated. I mentioned already early on that there is only a small circle of professionals who can provide this service. But then one must also be careful. Let's say if we have a registrar or an administrative agent, they are per se also authorized to provide these services to funds. If we have a bank, of course, this is not, a bank can potentially do many things. But if the bank for the first time wants to provide fund administration or domiciliation or corporate services to funds, it must apply for, let's call it, it's not a separate license because it has one license as a bank, but it's still, it must provide its, let's call it business plan to the CSF and show to the CSF how it will perform these services as a fund administrator. So that there is a specific CSF authorization to when they want to provide this service for the first time. But then also at the level, it is at the level of the service provider, but then also at the level of the fund. If a regulated fund, it would, maybe it's going too far to say that the CSF must approve the domiciliary or the corporate service agent for the fund. But so the CSF will approve the prospectus, they will approve the fund documents. And in there, of course, they will check, has this fund appointed the fund administrator? Who is the domiciliary? Is it the same or is it somebody else? So all of that will be checked by the CSF. So both on the side of the service provider and at the level of the fund. What is also specific for funds is that so the address of the fund's domicile is typically mentioned in the fund prospectus, that the service provider is typically mentioned, at least the fund administrator, and then typically you will see that the fund's address is also the same address as the address of the administrator, or as said, if it's somebody else, and of course that there can be a different address. Maybe there will be a practical question, if you only change, because later on we will talk about change of service provider, and then if you only change the domiciliary agent, or let's say the domiciliary agent moves to another premise, what is the consequence for the fund prospectus? And there we have seen recently, so that in other cases, that the CSF said, well, you don't have to update the prospectus immediately, but they were saying, but please do it at the next occasion, but at the latest within 6 months, for example. So if it's only the address that is changing, they don't expect that you update the prospectus immediately. Another practical question is about, so now we talked a lot about the fund. What about other entities that you often use in the context of funds, like GP, SPV, carry vehicle, advisory companies? They can, of course, also all be domiciled at the same address. That also has certain advantages, but they can also be at a different address. One must just be careful if you have the GP domiciled at a different address, if then the GP, if you have the board, for example, board meetings of the GP always at the registered office of the GP, which is a different address than the registered office of the fund, that could potentially lead to difficulties. So not that then one day somebody would say, the fund is at the address A, but the GP, the board of the GP has always met at the address B. And then you can wonder, what is the real registered office of the fund? So I think typically one would see that both are at the same address, and it can have advantages and disadvantages also when it comes to sharing documents, preparing board packs. So this is something that Mathieu knows very well. So if everything is at the level of one service provider, it's of course much easier for that service provider to prepare the board packs. If they are at the same time the administrator of the fund, they have access to that information, and it will be easy for them to prepare the board packs of the GP. If there are different service providers, it can work, but in my own experience, I have then often seen that they were saying, "Oh, but we didn't receive the information from the other." So the more there are different parties involved, the more the communication can get a bit more difficult. And then just to conclude on this slide, a few remarks regarding the delegation by the fund administrator of the domiciliation to a third party. So those are the conditions applicable to the delegation by the fund administrator of any of its functions. So meaning that the administrator must still monitor the delegated tasks. There must be a written contract. There must be an adequate due diligence on the delegate, putting in place key performance indicators, key risk indicators, and periodic due diligence. But so this is really what is imposed by the CSF on the fund administrator when they wish to delegate any function, including the domiciliation function.
Yeah, and just maybe a small comment based on what you said. Indeed, board meetings usually are held at the registered address. You have no office when you choose a domiciliary agent, but part of the service, the standard is to put available a meeting room for these board meetings on the top of the domiciliary activity. Yeah. So everyone should be able to meet at the registered address normally. Now, let's talk. I hope that you get sufficient context on who and how it works with a domiciliary agent and corporate services. We try to keep it short. There is a lot to say, of course, but now let's go to the core content of the presentation. That was how do you select or appoint your domiciliary agent or your corporate services provider. And I wanted to focus on the request for proposal. Because this request for proposal, it's a process that is used for identifying who would be your services provider for this activity, that is used for large clients. To be honest, if it's a small corporate that will come to you, you will not have this type of request for proposal. But we are used to do some in Arendt Investor Services, definitely. And how it works. So you have a sponsor, so a client that needs these services, that will select a project manager, and the project manager will prepare this request for proposal and will contact the potential bidders. That's the naming, so sponsors, bidders. So as a domiciliary agent or corporate services provider, you are a bidder in this request for proposal. And it works both sides. On the level of the bidders, so the service provider, you will have to gather some information. Of course, how many board members, where they are located, what's the volume of the activity, and so on. And the project manager will collect all of this information and evaluate this answer. So you receive a list, a huge list. So you may have a question about the timing of delivery of the services. So when you select a service provider, you may, if it's domiciliation, you will check if they have office available for your meeting. You will check where is located the office. If your board members are far away, needs to come by the airport, makes sense to choose a domiciliation that is close to the airport, for example. So you have some criteria, but again, will depends on the needs, on the composition of the boards. So it's difficult to say. We always look at the financial assessments. Of course, there is a fee proposal, but the fees are not always the ones that will be used to take a final decision. And to be honest, the fees for domiciliary activity, it's not a lot, from, I don't know, let's say from 1,000 to 3,000, depending on the what do you put in the domiciliation fees. If you put also the management of the correspondence, what are the tools you use to save the electronic files and so on, what's the ad hoc services. But domiciliation anyway is always part of a bigger services offering. Usually you offer domiciliation of companies to clients that are also willing to do additional services with you. So there is a detailed due diligence that is done by the board or the project manager in this case, but you need to, of course, check the domiciliary agent, the reputation, to ask for reference if they have other big clients. If you prefer to use a large services provider or small service provider, so the selection, usually you try to get at least 3-4 fee quotes and to compare on these criteria. Commercial, I mean commercial in the sense of what are the ancillary activities that you may need in the future. Ask to your corporate services provider, and you will check, because usually you say, I want board meetings and shareholders meeting, but maybe on the long term you will need assistance on accounting or on reporting, on or updates on or some communication with CSSF. So this commercial aspect is mainly linked to what are the ancillary services that in the future also may be used, because you never know. You choose today a service provider for certain type of services, but maybe on the long term you will define additional needs, and the service provider should be in a position also to give you a list of ad hoc services that can be offered in the future. So it may also play a role, because otherwise, if you have additional needs, you will have to select various services provider or to change your service provider, and it's never good, and we'll talk about it later on. In terms of let's say administrative workload, it can be a bit cumbersome to change. So that's why you need to be cautious when you select your service provider. And the same, you will have to provide a lot of compliance documentation. So I know that for some board members to change means also to give again the ID cards, certified true copy, a structure chart, and to reply to some questions. So that's why the process needs to be, let's say, done carefully when you select your domiciliary agent or corporate services provider. And I mentioned interviews because in this process, but globally speaking, you will have to meet the service providers, or you have to go to the domiciliary agent and you will discuss with them. Now, what I see is, of course, you discuss the target operating model. So how do you want to work on these services and activities? Usually it's about deadline also. For example, if you provide board meetings, minutes, you will discuss about timeline also. You will discuss a lot about IT tools currently, as you may be aware, the use of tools like board intelligence or diligent or some DocuSign or whatever. They will ask you what are the IT tools. So at the level now of the corporate services provider or domiciliary agent, you have to share also all of these IT tools that you use, and usually you have also a due diligence on your IT to identify the risk, linked again to data protection, GDPR, and so on. So you have all of these interviews. And what we see here on the request for proposal, that is quite a long process, because it takes minimum, I would say, 2 months. First, you signed a NDA, so a non-disclosure agreement. Then you get this request for proposal with all the details of the need. Then you reply to the question. That there is an assessment by the project manager, let's say. Then you are shortlisted, and linked to this shortlist, you have interviews and so on. So it's quite a long process that takes at least 2 months, but it can be 8 months or even more. It depends. But it's a difficult process, and I wanted to focus on that to show you how it works when it's large outsourcing. But this is applicable also for any type of entities. Each single company should follow the same approach, the same spirit, let's say, when you select your service provider, because usually you keep your registered address for many, many years and potentially until the end of the company. Now, Francis wanted to give some words on the ongoing monitoring and the selection also on his side.
Yes, thank you, Mathieu. And maybe just to mention what I've meant, the remarks that I put here. So it's in the context of investment funds, but then I think the general principles again apply to what the board of any company should do. So the fund board, like for any company, the fund board is ultimately responsible for the good functioning of the entity and for protecting the best interest of the shareholders. So that's true for funds, but also for any others. And therefore, it's also up to the fund board to act with due care and diligence when selecting the domiciliary agent. I think that is also what Mathieu has now been talking about. So how does this process work? He has mentioned to you how this RFP process works, but from a legal or from a corporate governance point of view, it's also this process then helps the fund boards to demonstrate if it is challenged by shareholders, for example, the fund board must be able to argue, well, why have I chosen this service provider? Because it's I think it offers the best service, because the fees are adequate. So in case something goes wrong later on, the board must be able to show that it has been careful and diligent in selecting this agent. So that's at the time of choosing the agent. It's of course also true later on for the ongoing supervision of the domiciliary agent. The fund board must also be aware of the contractual setup. That is what I mentioned earlier on. So they should know who are their service providers. Did the fund entrust the fund administration to the administrator and domiciliation is included in there? Or is the domiciliation entrusted to somebody else? Or is it delegated by the fund administrator? Why is that important for the fund board? Well, it's important because, of course, the role of the fund board, yes, is to how can it perform its duties best? Well, in supervising all of its service providers, and to supervise the service providers, the board must receive reports from the service providers on their activities. So you typically have then the quarterly board meetings where each of the fund service providers provide their reports. So the fund board, they must know from whom will I receive the report? When will I receive this report? Is the report from the fund administrator also including domiciliation aspects or not? So this is why this is important for the fund board to know, so that they can monitor all of those activities. They must also have access, of course, if needed, they must have access to documents and data. They must formally approve all service providers, including then, of course, you have domiciliation or corporate services, if that is separate from fund administration. But so this is an important point that the CSF is also monitoring. Has there really been assigned, or it sounds very obvious, but sometimes then it happens that you cannot find the agreement, or you don't remember did we sign it or not. But that's something that the CSF does not like at all. So you must formally approve those agreements. And so the fund board must be able to give instructions or to terminate the agreement. I think later on, Mathieu will talk about the possibility for the domiciliation agent to terminate the agreement. But of course, let's say the fund or generally the client must also be able to terminate. So if they consider, well, we think that this service provider does not perform its services well, then the company or the fund must also be able to terminate.
Maybe to specify that the domiciliation agreement or a written agreement that is indicating the address of the company, it's mandatory by law. It's part of the law of the domiciliation law of 1999. And if you don't have one, but it's not possible because it's mandatory for a domiciliary agent, the domiciliary agent is subject to a fine or even some imprisonment. There is some sanction. So you will never get a registered address if you don't enter into a written agreement. And that will
And
explicitly define the address. That's all.
Yes. And what I would maybe add is that if you have some small companies or like SPVs or others, it may be that this corporate or domiciliary agent is their only service provider. And why was I so much insisting here on all of this supervision and monitoring by the fund board? Well, that's because the fund has many service providers, like depositary administrator, and then potentially separate domiciliation agent. And so therefore, given that it's more difficult to follow everyone, therefore it's really important for also the fund board to have really a dedicated process for following everyone, because otherwise, some information might get lost.
So a few words on the domiciliation agreement, because as just mentioned, this is mandatory by law. It's important to know what should be the minimum content. You have so I put the article 1 to enter into a written agreement known as domiciliation agreement. So there is no exception. And we have the chance to have also a circular CSSF, the 0129, that provides the minimum content of the domiciliation. I wanted to show you the minimum content because if you have any questions on some of the topics, feel free to put in the chat. But it can also give you some additional details. So, of course, the subject matter of the agreement, the right and obligation of the domiciliary agent of companies. For example, it's to put available the documentation of the companies to the board members. So the board members should be able to come and see their files or to request their files, definitely. The responsibility of the domiciliation of companies also are in here, a right and obligation of the company. So as a company, you should also do your best or everything possible to ensure that your domiciliary agent is able to meet his function. One obligation is also to pay the fees, for example, but you need to be in line with the law as a company. And we'll discuss later why on the termination. You need to define in here all the instructions and communication mode, how it works, and it's really important. This is maybe the most important question as soon as you define your domiciliary agent is how I will get my document. So is it on a daily basis? Is it on a weekly basis? Is there some important document that I want to see now, but if it's CSSF correspondence, for example, I want to have it within a day. So you need really to define that, because if you have a domiciliary agent that is, let's say, sleeping on the document for a week, you may face some challenge to manage your company properly. So this communication mode, how I work with electronic document or physical document, is quite important, and all is defined in this agreement. The contact for both parties is also defined. Communication is key. So in this role, so you need really to pay attention to this clause. Commissions, of course, the duration and termination of the agreement. Usually the duration is unlimited, but you may have some clause regarding the termination of the agreement from one way or another, someone who is not respecting the rights and obligation of the contract, of course. Applicable law and settlement of disputes. This is the article standard that you find in all agreements, and there is no need to say that for domiciliary activity, you are always subject to Luxembourg law because it's a Luxembourg service. So the applicable law, it should be always Luxembourg, definitely, for the domiciliation in Luxembourg. And the Tribunal of Luxembourg are the competent authorities to settle disputes on this domiciliation agreement.
Yeah, and then Moving on to how does this agreement look like on the fund side? And yeah, so I've mainly mentioned, and here let's take the case where the fund administration agreement also includes domiciliation functions. And then here again, based on this CSF circular 22811, we have some requirements for that agreement. Again, yeah, it must be a written contract, as mentioned early on, setting out the roles and responsibilities of each parties, a description of the services, and yeah, so that's particularly important because, as you know, it is possible to split the fund administration tasks between different providers, including the domiciliation or corporate services. That's why it's important to clearly define who does what in case you have multiple service providers. The question, if in the other case you first appoint one service provider, then the question, can they delegate some tasks to somebody else? And then indeed, yeah, some more standard clauses like confidentiality. But confidentiality is of course important here as well. If we also talk about shareholder information, given that this service provider necessarily has access to information regarding the shareholders, and this is of course then also confidential information potentially on private persons. So there are of course confidentiality aspects or data protection is very important. Yeah, procedures for transmitting the information, Mathieu was already mentioning. Yeah, so no sleeping on information for 1 week, as Mathieu was saying. And yeah, typically one would also have an operating memorandum, at least when it comes to fund administration, given that this concept is much broader now than the pure domiciliation. Therefore, for the full fund administration, you would typically have an operating memorandum. I guess, Mathieu, if it's only domiciliation, or maybe also for corporate services, I assume there you don't always have an
No,
operating memorandum.
it's not automatic.
Mm.
Because this is used for the monitoring of the function that you have in the fund industry, let's say. But this review meeting and this monitoring of operating memorandum, for a simple SPV, usually you don't put in place this type of operating memorandum. So because there is no strong monitoring, let's say, done by the board to the same extent as some funds. With funds now, we may have a monthly meeting review, some KPIs, quarterly meetings, annual review. It's the monitoring is strong, but this is, let's say, the exception. The exception, again, that is becoming bigger than the standard because the fund industry is growing. But historically, you didn't have all of this. When I started my career 20 years ago, it was not existing. But because of the fund industry and the monitoring and the requirement from the CSSF, now it becomes a bit a standard to provide some KPIs to your client based on an operating memorandum and to have this oversight by the board on the performance of your activity.
Okay.
Not for
And yeah,
domiciliation. Domiciliation, I
Yeah.
never seen any operating memorandum or KPIs or whatever.
Yes, I imagine. And then indeed, just to finish on that slide, so what is also specific for funds, yeah, we mentioned already earlier on. So like any other agreements entered into, well, at least with the main service providers, like depository, administrator, manager, all of those agreements must be submitted to the CSSF. And yeah, in the past, one had to submit all of those agreements to the CSF in draft. Then they were reviewing it, they were commenting on it, and then you could, once you got the approval for the fund, you could sign all of those agreements. But the CSF was reviewing them upfront. This has now changed since a few years, where the CSF has put in place this contract conformity letter, so which means that they no longer review the agreements upfront, but the fund is, when submitting its the the whole package for approval of the fund, they also submit this. It's a confirmation letter, to confirm that the agreement complies with all legal and regulatory requirements. And there is also in this, because that's the letter is in like an online tool, and when you click on it, so that there is a selection box, and there is a specific box also for the domiciliation agent, for example. So the requirement to use this contract conformity letter also applies to a domiciliation agreement if you have a separate domiciliation agreement for regulated investment funds. Then maybe we can come to the next. Yeah, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just forgot to mention in the selection process, but it's also something that I see a lot. The language used by the board members, if they are all German, for example, you will try to have a corporate secretary or corporate services provider that is able to provide you a German speaker. I think it's part now of the selection. Of course, English is the common language used, but I see the selection is really impacted by this in a positive way. If you are able to provide the same language as the board, because we're in an international country, and it's quite frequent that the board members are coming from abroad. You have some Luxembourg resident, definitely, especially for regulated funds, independent directors, and so on. But you have part of the board that is abroad, and also that's something you can have a deep look on and request to your services provider what are the language that you are able to talk, and so on. And I see also some documentation in German, for example, in some funds. So definitely, if the documentation is in German and your service provider says, I'm not able to understand German, that's an issue. So you should choose a service provider that is able to understand the documentation of the company, the main language, let's say. So just wanted to this side comment. Sorry.
No problem. Then just also a brief remark on the cost. Because we mentioned already, well, I think Mathieu, you mentioned early on, also in the selection process, one of the elements to consider is indeed the cost or the commission or the fees of the agent. If we are in the context of an investment fund, we must know so that the rule is that any fees or expenses or charges that are to be borne by the fund must somehow be disclosed in the documents. Now there are various ways of disclosing it. So you have some fees where it's not possible to quantify in advance how much it will be. What should I say? Or like transaction cost or cost for reporting or for registering the fund in different countries. There you don't know the amount in advance, and then you would just list the type of cost, but without a figure. And then if we talk about what should I say, the fund manager, there you would always give an amount or a percentage or basis point rate for this type of fee. Typically for fund administration, you would also give an indication with figures in the fund documents. In particular, if we speak about UCITS or retail funds, I think the CSF would typically expect to see a figure. For alternative funds, you can also, in particular, if they are not regulated by the CSF, you can also sometimes see that there is no fee, so no amount indicated in the offering document, but just to state, well, that it's in line with the market practice. So there you see different type of approaches. Both can be feasible. And again, so of course, it depends on your setup. If domiciliation is included in fund administration, you would typically not separately list the fee for domiciliation, but you would just list the fee for fund administration in total. But yeah, there are various types of models, but just to think about that, this cost must also be included or listed. In particular, if if domiciliation is not included in fund administration, then you must be careful. Or if you have two separate service providers, then you must be careful that you don't put in the prospectus, yeah, the fund administrator receives this and this amount of fees, and you forget about the domiciliation, because if it's not mentioned anywhere, then this could be challenged, and somebody could say, well, you didn't mention it, therefore you cannot charge these fees to the fund. So that's maybe a practical advice, in particular if the functions are separate, yeah, to be very careful that then both are listed.
All good for you, Francis?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So now let's talk on the change of services provider. So we define the context. You see how to select the basics. Now how to change service provider. So first of all, you know that when you incorporate a company, you need to know in advance, of course, what is the registered address. It will be requested by the notary. When he does the filing of the incorporation deed, he will also mention the registered address. So the definition, the who is responsible for the domiciliation address, these are the shareholders. So that's the shareholders that should define the registered address. But in the articles of association, when you see the clause on the domiciliation of the company, usually you don't put the defined address. You will just say that the company is located in the commune of Luxembourg, for example. And at the end of the incorporation deed, you will have this shareholders decision that will appoint the board members or the auditors and or réviseur d'entreprise, and they will also give the defined registered address, and that's the one that will be filed by the notary to the RESA. So why we do that? It's because each time there is a change of registered office within the same commune, this clause says, look, this is located in the commune of Luxembourg, and the board is able to move this registered address within the commune. The reason why it's in the same commune, it's because of tax. The impôt commercial communal is different depending on the commune in Luxembourg. So if you want to move to another commune, you have an impact on the taxation of your company, and that's where the shareholders should give their approval and even take the decision. Because again, this is the decision from the shareholders at first, but now, honestly, 95%, maybe more, of the articles of association are not defining the registered address in the articles of association, but are giving the board members the authority to move to another office if necessary within the same commune. That is something that we do in practical really easily, and that's really appreciated. So pay attention when you incorporate a new company. Do not put the address in these articles, but wait for the transitory part at the end of the articles of association. So now let's consider this is not included in the articles of association. As mentioned, the board get a delegation of authority to change the registered address. So it will be a board meeting that will take the decision to move your address, and that will also approve the new domiciliary agreement. And based on this approval plus the signing of the domiciliation agreement, this has to be filed to the registered address as soon as possible to become towards third parties, to be opposable towards third parties, and even this is mandatory now to file this registered address and to update this. I don't know, Francis, if there is a minimum time frame for that. Usually it's 1 month for appointment of board members or whatever. So I would say do it within a month when there is a change, but the soonest the better, definitely, in terms of filing. Now, when it comes to corporate services provider, in a normal SPV, let's say, it's not mentioned in the RCS extract. It's mentioned at the RESA. So this is a decision from the board members this time. So board members will take a board meeting or even through a circular resolution and they will approve the entry into a services agreement. But there is no filing to be done. This is the difference. You can see that with domiciliation law, with filings requirement, even penalties or fine if you don't have a domiciliation, or even worse, now it can be, we will discuss later on, but at the end, from a regulator perspective, I believe that domiciliation is even more key than a service provider, let's say, in terms of framework. That's my personal opinion, but when I see that, I think they wanted to focus on the domiciliation and to know where is registered the company, where is the registered address. So we mentioned the importance of the agreement. Now, definitely the filing in the RESA is mandatory. And yes, change of corporate agent, honestly, there is not that much to do. You need to terminate the former agreement and to enter into a new one. And all the termination of your agreements are defined within the agreement. Usually there is a notice period. So, but if not, you could even change with immediate effect, and same for your registered address. But you need to check your agreement in place to see if you have a notice period to be done. And now that we discussed the legal step, as you see, it's quite straightforward. What are the operational steps? And from an operational perspective, it's not that straightforward, let's say, because first of all, when you change your registered office, I will discuss mainly on the registered office because this is the main impact, but you can, in a way, adapt this to corporate services. This is less difficult, let's say, or it's different because this is at the level of the domiciliary agent that you have all the documentation of the company, and this is what we will discuss now. But with corporate services, of course, you have also the handover to be done between the previous corporate services provider and the new ones, especially with funds when you are in middle of 2 quarterly boards and you change your corporate secretary, who is in charge of the board pack, who is in charge of the booking the meeting, in the preparation of the quarterly board, or the minutes and so on. This is something needs to be discussed between the services providers also. So now going back on domiciliation, you have to do an inventory at the level of the former services providers, and depending on the company, some companies that are 20 years old, and as a domiciliary agent, you have all the history since the first day of the company. And sometimes you also received this document from another previous services provider that is also received. It can be also the third time that we have this type of exercise. That the inventory is really key because it appears over the time, and some documents disappears sometimes, and that's not good at all. So the inventory is really key. Why? Because you will take all your binders and your electronic savings, and you will list everything that you have. This checklist will be used for the transfer of files. So usually it happens even after these legal steps that we discussed. So you are already defining your new address. The best case scenario will be that the same day of the change of address, you will have the move of all the files, but it's never the case in practice. In practice, it happens weeks after, and the reason is this inventory. The former services provider usually spends days doing this inventory to have it complete, because the new services provider will have to check the list, check the document he received, and ensure that if the former service provider says, I give you the register of shareholders, you need to ensure that you indeed have it. If you lost the shareholders register in between, you will have to convince a board, to convene a board, to cancel the register of shareholder that is lost, to issue a new one. So it creates additional work and so on. So this inventory is key. And mention register of shareholders, but honestly, if you lose your agreements, and it's the same. So you need really to pay attention not to lose any document. And for some companies, you can have boxes and boxes of documents. So it depends. So that's why I said at the beginning, choose carefully your domiciliary agent, because changing domiciliation leads sometimes to operational issues. Now you have two types of documents, physical and electronic. So physical documents, it's an easy one. but the electronic documents, you have various ways of sharing electronic documents, and that's something also that needs to be discussed with the two services provider. Nowadays, you have some share files, or you have some link you receive and it downloads all the electronic document, or you have sometimes also a USB key that is encrypted and you can share. But you need to discuss also between services provider what are the tools available both sides that will facilitate the sharing of this electronic document. And today, with the electronic signatures and the qualified signatures that are used a lot now for some clients, electronic documents can be the big part of your documentation at the end. And even you may have no agreements now in original version. This is the electronic version that is equivalent to an original, that is the let's say the original document. So if you don't collect all the electronic documentation, you may also miss not only the scanned copy of your binders, but also the original version of some agreements. So it's really key to discuss this electronic documentation transfer. And definitely it will become more and more important in the years to come, because now that even the notary are starting to accept electronic documentation and so on, we are really moving in a way that the only limit of the electronic signing will be if it's out of Europe, because it's a European certificate, or if there is some restriction because of its real estate activity and so on. But globally speaking, I believe that physical documents are tending to decrease a bit. And pay attention to this electronic documentation. And to be honest, some inventories, there is, depending on who is doing the inventory, you have some main difference. Some people are doing a list, everything is mixed up, and some people are doing a list per topics and so on that is really structured. So it depends. If you are lucky, as you have a good list, and or if you are not lucky, you have just a mix up of everything, and it's a nightmare. But this is really key to spend some time on it, because when you sign the checklist as a new service provider, but you confirm that you receive of this documentation. And in terms of practicalities, depends. In the past, years ago, you had a courtier that came, take all the binders, sign the checklist, and it was done. Well, now it's not the case anymore. You usually book a meeting room, you spend a day with the documents, and you check the list really carefully. I see also a change in the past years in the way of doing this exercise that is quite serious now. People are really paying attention. But if your new service provider is sending a courtier and sign the checklist without checking, you can already tell yourself, maybe I didn't select the best one. So never trust the former service provider, and pay attention. For corporate secretary, it's a bit different, because if the domiciliation is not with the corporate secretary, or for the corporate services, you send all the documents to the domiciliary agent. So when you change corporate services provider, you will mainly discuss on the status of any transaction, or work that is ongoing, and who is managing what, and when you stop your services, when the next one is taking over the rest. But from a documentation perspective, of course, it's quite limited in such case. So it's easier to change services provider, out of my view, than to change domiciliation. I wanted to emphasize the difficulty operationally to move your registered address from an operational perspective.
Maybe Mathieu, as you have been speaking about the electronic documents, I think that there was a question in the chat, but I think you have answered it already implicitly. But so that there was the question if, in case of electronic documents, one must still print it and put it into binders. I guess not, but I let you answer.
Yes, I think it's a good thing to do it, but it's just having a copy of an original. The original is the electronic version, because when you save an electronic a qualified document, so meaning a signature electronic with a qualification, you have the certification issued by either LuxTrust or DocuSign, so issued by the electronic signing tool that will confirm that this is equivalent to an original, that will give all the criteria, because well, I can maybe discuss a little bit more at the end on this if we still have time, because it's a long story, this electronic signature. But when you print it, you lose the qualification of original. So the only when you sign a document with a qualified signature, only the electronic version is valid. Printing means that it's just that you are doing a copy that has the same, but still it can be used in front of the court. But it in terms of proof, you still have to prove that the signatories are correct and so on. With a qualified signature, with the electronic version, it's to the counterpart to try to justify that the signatories are wrong and it's not correctly signed. So it's a question of proof, but only during litigation. It's still it's for litigation lawyers, these questions, but yes, don't print it. But I think it's a good practice. If you, for example, if you file now some tax returns electronically directly on the tax authority's website, the good practice is to print what you filed and to put it in the binders. Of course, you can recover everything on the websites, but the plan is really to have a complete papers binders. This is the current practice. Will it change in the future? I don't know, but this is again good practice to print everything and to have everything in binders. If you lose your electronic version, at least you have something. And the paper, and that's why paper is still interesting, because if you crash your computer, and that's part of the question that we have when you select a service provider. What are your backup? Where are stored your data? What are your business continuity plan in case there is a fire in the building, etc. We had this in the past with the safety of the original documentation, but now we have the same with the safety of the electronic versions. As mentioned, in the electronic version, you have equivalent to original documentation. So the question now should be addressed on both sides on the storage of the documentation.
Thank you, Mathieu. Yeah, then again, let's look into what is specific in case of change of domiciliation for investment funds. I think everything that Mathieu said just early on for other entities is of course also correct for investment funds. Here we have some indications again based on this CSF circular 22.811, which applies to also change of fund administrator. But then, as said early on, in many cases this also includes domiciliation and corporate services function. And so pursuant to this circular, the current and the new administrator, they must agree on the process. And how is this agreement materialized? Well, then there is typically a migration plan, indeed, and setting out the date of the transfer, the duties and responsibilities of each parties. How is the electronic and physical data transferred? So I think that's what Mathieu mentioned already early on, and the accessibility to historical data. So it's everything that Mathieu was talking about, but we have which for funds must necessarily also be included in a formal migration plan, and this migration plan, in case of regulated funds, must also be submitted to the CSF, because if you change service provider for regulated fund, the CSF must give its approval, and then you would typically submit to the CSF the agreement with the new service provider, the updated prospectus, this migration plan, and then also a notice to the shareholders, so to inform them of the change. So I now mentioned only the update of the prospectus, Also, as Mathieu said early on, if you change, if the new domiciliation agent is in a different municipality, you will have to change the articles of the fund, and so then in that case you will also need to provide to the CSF the updated articles of incorporation. Yeah, we mentioned the notice already. I had a question about the notice period. So then, as you know, let's say for open-ended funds, we have the general principle that there is a simple notice without a specific prior notice that is sent out if it's just a matter of informing shareholders of smaller changes. For more substantial changes, for example, increase of fees or any change that can be negative for the shareholders, you must give the shareholders at least 1 month's notice in advance, so that if they don't agree, they can exit the fund. And here for change of service provider, that as such is typically considered to be neutral, except if the new service provider charges higher fees, or let's say substantially higher fees. Then the CSF could say, but this is ultimately borne by the investors, and then those who don't agree with that, they must have the rights to exit. So they're typically simple notice for change of service provider will be sufficient, except if it is becoming more costly, then the CSF might ask for 1 month's notice. And then, to one small point also. So that's in case of change of the domiciliation agent, which is a delegate of the fund administrator, then the fund must also consent to that change, because there is a transfer of data to another delegate of the fund administrator. And if that also includes investor data, then this transfer must also be disclosed to investors, so also for GDPR purposes. I think that is all that I wanted to say from a fund point of view, and then over to you, Mathieu, for the last slide on the termination.
Yeah, and I see that we have a couple of questions, so maybe I can reply to the first one now. So when fund administration, accounting, and TA and domiciliation COSEC services are provided by different providers, is the domiciliation COSEC agent still required to identify the shareholders and hold the shareholder register? So in terms of identification of the shareholders, as mentioned at the beginning, either as domiciliation agent or a corporate secretarial or COSEC service provider, you will have to identify shareholders, definitely. This is the obligation of the service provider itself that needs to do their own AML compliance. So you can't rely on if it's another service provider that is providing fund administration, you can't rely on the fund administration compliance. As soon as you enter into an agreement with a counterpart, you need to identify the counterpart, including shareholders, UBOs, and so on. Now, for holding the shareholder register, it's a bit different. As COSEC agent, you don't have to, definitely. So I think you was specifying this for domiciliation. When there is a fund, usually that's the TA who has the shareholder registered. You don't have any original version of the register. It's an electronic version maintained by the TA. So as COSEC, when you do your shareholders meeting, you would request from the TA the shareholder register, because it's the only one who has the up-to-date version. And as a domiciliary agent, you don't have the last version of the shareholder register anyway, because it will change for some funds every day. So as domiciliary agent, you have to keep the register of shareholders for the companies with no TA. When there is an original shareholder register, this is with usually the domiciliary agent. It's not mandatory. You can have a domiciliary agent, and then you can rent an office and put some documents in here. So usually when you have a domiciliary agent, you have no office at all, and that's why all the documentation is at the domicile of the company. but I hope it replies to your question. So now the reply is no. Shareholder register, when there is a TA, you can find it at least the last and updated version at the registered address. It's impossible, and if you need one as board members, you will contact your TA, or you will contact your COSEC, who will contact your TA. At the end, it's the TA. If it's an original version, it's different. It will be with the domiciliation.
Yes, yeah, or at least one could probably say that at least the domiciliary, because it's indeed a little bit a tricky question, because the domiciliation agent is still subject to the domiciliation law, even if indeed the fund has appointed a different transfer agent. So it is a little bit tricky, but I would say that at least if the domiciliation agent can have access to the list of shareholders, if that can be provided to the domiciliation agent relatively easily, then the domiciliation agent can still be considered to be compliant with the domiciliation law. But because it's a little bit tricky, because the law still applies.
The law says you need to identify everyone at the moment of the entry into the agreement. Then you have this regular update. Depending on the activity, you will, as a domiciliary agent or COSEC services provider, request to reapprove, let's say, the file from a compliance perspective, request an update of the shareholders register. Same in the agreement, usually you have the obligation for the clients, let's say the company, to inform the service provider in case of a change of beneficial owner. So it's even in the contract, you will receive this information through the contract. As soon as the board is aware that there is a change of beneficial owner, they should file, they should inform services provider. So you will get this information. And out of my view, the practice is that you do this regular update of your compliance file, and that's where you will identify if there is some changes and so on.
Yeah.
But when there is a TA, you are a bit blind. It's only the TA that sees what are the new shareholders coming in and the shareholders that are going out. So that's why we have this regular update, 3 years usually. Depends if it's a medium risk or high risk or low risk. But
okay. Should we maybe still just have a quick look at the last slide and then come back to
the last slide
question?
replies to some questions, I believe, on the termination or denunciation. So let's go. This is the last slide. So the domiciliation law is authorizing the domiciliary agent to denounce the registered address, to denounce the agreement. And if they do that because the company's statutory bodies and representative contravene the legal provisions governing commercial companies and the right of establishment, so it depends. It can be usually if they don't pay your fees, you will denounce at some point. But if they don't close their annual accounts, if they are not in line with the law, you are able to denounce. And as long as the denunciation is supported by this, you have no consequences at all. So you will just file this to the RESA, and then the RESA, when they receive a denunciation, usually they contact the parquet and they check what's going on, and so on. It's triggering some stuff at the level of the authorities. But as a service provider, you can definitely denounce a domiciliation, and it happens. It happens, and there is no risk, because usually it's because the company is in breach with the domiciliary agreement. You have to do it by registered letter to inform, of course, your board members, with or without notice period. If it's really a severe breach of the agreement, usually you have no notice period. And Francis maybe will precise a bit about regulated fund, but you have to file it with the RESA for taking effect. And as explained, on the long term consequence, let's say, if you are not able quickly to find a new domiciliary agent, you may face a judicial dissolution of your company. a company has to needs to have a registered address, a defined location. If not, on a long term, you are in a severe breach with the law, and you will face a judicial dissolution. Your company will be liquidated by law. So this is really key, and I see that it's also one of the questions. What's the risk of a domicile denouncing a client? So again, there is no risk if the company is not complying with regulation, etc., not paying its fees. So no risk. And the other question from Paul was upon termination of an agreement, does filing the end of domiciliation agreement with the RCS exempt the domiciliation from any responsibility if the entity takes too long to change providers? Well, this is questions for litigation lawyers. Before to say anything, Francis, do you know do you know what you would like to say? Because me, I have some ideas, but I'm not sure if it's something I can.
I have no preconceived idea, I must say, but indeed, I would normally say, well, of course, so in principle, the service provider wants to continue working for its clients. So it's really only if you see that the client is not complying with the laws or regulation, then you terminate and you potentially denounce the termination to the register. But I think, as you said, Mathieu, and so from the time that the denunciation is really, how would I say? So it helps the domiciliation agent to end its responsibility, and so that's why exempt from any responsibility. I would say indeed yes. So that's the at least if we talk about denunciation, there for sure the responsibility ends. Now here, if we talk about a kind of in between, if we talk about a situation where the agreement has been terminated but not yet the denunciation done, maybe one, yeah, it's a little bit tricky, but in principle, once the agreement has ended, the agent is no longer responsible, I would say. It's then, of course, what happens if the agent has terminated the agreement, but still no new service provider has been identified. Of course, then the old service provider cannot just throw away all the documents. So that is a little bit the issue. So I think you must still be, how would I say, in French you would say en bon père de famille. You would still keep the documents until you hope that you find a new service provider. But the level of responsibilities is probably very, very low there.
Okay, now we have a question. Does an IFM who is not a PSF providing domiciliation services to fund and GP only because they are also IFM need to follow the law of 1999, or do they fall under a different regulation? So the law of 1999 is applicable for the domiciliary agent. And you may have, for example, your company that is domiciled in the office of another entity of the group. And this other entity of the group, in such case, is not a domiciliary agent because you are intra-group. It's not a third party to the group. So I try to extend a bit the answers, not only for IFM, but to reply to a question, no, the law in such case is not applicable. The law is applicable to domiciliary agents. So if you don't request the agreement, and if you not provide these domiciliation services as a business, but just because you are owning the office, so all the entities of the group are also domiciled at the same address, you will not face the same. You will not be subject to the law of 1999. It doesn't mean that in practice you should do the same, but the law is applicable to the domiciliary agent only. I hope it replied to your question. And Francis, let me know because I see as you are nodding, so maybe I'm too strict on that part. But I would say,
it's or maybe not strict enough, but it's also a tricky question because I just got it took me a copy of the law, which indeed says it. So in Article 1, who can provide the services, and then it says at the end of Article 1, this article is not applicable to intra-group or to the domiciliation of a fund by its management company, which you could also interpret if it says that only this article is not applicable. Then you could also think, well, then the rest of the law is still potentially applicable. So but the answer is I'm not 100% sure. So we still have things to discuss for our next breakfast meeting.
Okay, so we will check separately and revert to you, Paul, on this question. Article 1 is not applicable, but probably the rest is in such case. Let's see. I trust Francis on this one. What options are there to get the address removed from the RCL file in case of liquidation when the liquidator is not supportive? Usually the deed of liquidation will have to be published and the company will be struck from the register. So I don't really understand the question. Eloise, I don't know if you give unmute Hashim, but
I don't know where it's coming from. I'm wondering if it's your mic, because
the company is still in liquidation for various years. Hashim, if the company is still in liquidation, the company is still domiciled until the liquidation. So as long as if you want to terminate the domiciliation, you need to follow what are the conditions for the termination in the agreement, and you follow them. But what are the steps to follow in case the domiciliary agent discovers that there is an existing client is in breach of AML CFT legislation?
Mathieu,
yeah.
I don't know if you have an issue with your mic, because on my side I can hear some interferences. I don't know.
Yeah, I can hear it as well. Yeah.
Oh, okay. It's not only me.
So Francis, you take the lead.
So which questions do we still have? Or maybe at one point in time we also need to close. I think we went through. Which question were you still going to address?
We had a question. We had a question, will the company secretary ever become a regulated function in Luxembourg? And this is a good question for Ila. I'm not aware of any regulation of that. We changed the name as a CGO, a corporate governance officer, but still it's not really regulated. You have this certificate provided by Ila, for example, as a corporate governance officer, but it's not a regulated function today. In the future, I don't know, to be honest. And the last question was in case of a breach of AML CFT legislation, what are the steps to follow by a domiciliary agent? Francis, do you have the steps on your side?
Yeah. But I guess that, so as always in practice, you would try to follow up with the client and to remind them which are the documents or the information that they must provide. Probably you follow up once, twice, 3 times. So you would probably not immediately terminate once something is not provided, but you would give the chance to the client to provide it. But if that is then still not successful, I think that then at the end of the day, probably the only choice that remains is potentially to terminate the agreement. So that's one thing, the termination. And potentially if it's not only the question that the client did not provide certain documents, but if you really have a suspicion that there was actually some money laundering going on, well, then potentially you also must file a suspicion report to the financial intelligence unit. I think that's the way that I would see it. Okay.
I think we replied to all of the question. And
Okay.
yeah, we are a bit 10 minutes after the end. I'm sorry, Eloise, but a lot to say on this topic.
It's all fine. At least you answer all the questions, so it's good. Thank you very much, Mathieu and Francis. I think we will just have to end the breakfast briefing now. Regarding the timing, we're just a bit late, but thank you very much for speaking on this session, and thank you for all the participants for listening this session.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.